Hey man, there's a realization most men only reach after years of confusion, disappointment, and emotional exhaustion. It doesn't come from one breakup or one betrayal. It comes from a pattern repeating itself until you can no longer deny it. You look back and realize the words changed, the promises softened, the explanation shifted, and somehow you're the one left feeling foolish for believing what was said. And that's when the uncomfortable question appears: was she lying to me? The answer isn't as simple as yes or no. But if you don't understand what's actually happening, you'll keep getting burned while thinking you're just unlucky. Most men are raised to believe that words carry weight, that consistency equals character, and that if someone says something sincerely enough, it should mean something tomorrow. Men treat statements as contracts, as anchors, as reality, but the mistake is assuming everyone else experiences truth the same way. Because for many women, truth is not fixed, it's contextual. It lives inside emotion, it moves with feeling, and when the feeling changes, the story changes with it. Not out of malice, not out of planning, but out of internal alignment. This is where men feel lied to, not because a woman sat there plotting deception, but because she reinterpreted reality without noticing she was doing it. What she said last month felt true then, what she says now feels true now. And in her internal world, there's no contradiction, because the emotional state has shifted, and with it, the narrative. To a man, that feels like betrayal. To her, it feels like honesty. And unless you understand that difference, you'll keep trying to argue facts with feelings and losing every time. Here's the brutal truth. Most men resist. Emotions don't obey consistency. They obey comfort. They obey justification. They obey self-image. When a woman changes direction, she doesn't usually say, "I was wrong." She says, "I feel differently now." And in her mind, that's not a flaw, it's authenticity. That's why explanations after the fact often feel hollow. They're not explanations meant to clarify reality. They're explanations meant to protect identity, to avoid guilt, to maintain the image of being a good person who made a necessary choice. This is why men feel blindsided, because they assume loyalty is rooted in logic, while many women experience loyalty as emotional continuity. When the emotional environment changes, stress, boredom, attraction, insecurity, the internal justification adjusts automatically. Yesterday's promise doesn't feel binding today if today's emotions no longer support it. And instead of seeing this as deception, you need to see it as something far more dangerous: emotional truth replacing objective truth. Social conditioning makes this worse. Modern culture tells women that feelings are sacred, that discomfort means something is wrong, that intuition outranks accountability. So when a woman changes her mind, she's encouraged to trust that shift instead of question it. She's told growth means honoring how she feels now, not honoring what she committed to then. And when that mindset meets a man who believes words mean something permanent, the collision is inevitable. This is why so many men walk away confused instead of angry. They replay conversations. They search for contradictions. They ask, "But how could she say that and then do this?" What they don't realize is that they're trying to make sense of an emotional system using a logical framework. It doesn't work. It never has. And the longer you try to reconcile the two, the more unstable you become, because you start questioning your own perception. Here's the part no one tells you. The danger isn't that narrative shift. The danger is believing narratives over patterns. Words are snapshots of emotional states. Patterns are reality over time. A woman can sound sincere while being inconsistent. She can mean what she says while still changing direction later. And if you judge her by sincerity instead of consistency, you'll always feel misled, because sincerity does not guarantee stability. This doesn't mean you become cynical. It means you become observant. You stop investing based on promises. You stop anchoring yourself to declarations. You start watching what stays consistent when emotions fluctuate. How does she act when she's uncomfortable, when she's challenged, when she's not getting what she wants? That's where truth lives, not in reassurance, not in explanation, in behavior under pressure. And once you understand this, something powerful happens. You stop feeling lied to, not because people stop shifting, but because you stop mistaking emotional expression for commitment. You stop personalizing changes that were never about you in the first place. You stop arguing with reality, and instead of becoming bitter, you become grounded, calm, unshaken. Because a man who understands how narratives move no longer needs to chase truth. He watches it reveal itself. Most men make the fatal mistake right here. The moment they sense inconsistency, they rush to talk. They ask questions. They seek clarification. They demand reassurance. They believe that if they just communicate better, the truth will stabilize. But what they don't understand is that explanation doesn't restore alignment, it exposes insecurity. When a woman's emotions are shifting, your need for clarity doesn't anchor her, it pressures her, and pressure accelerates detachment, not honesty. From her perspective, your questions don't sound logical, they sound needy. Not because you are weak, but because you're asking her to reconcile feelings she hasn't processed herself. And instead of slowing down to reflect, she instinctively protects her emotional position. She reframes, she softens details, she edits the past, not to hurt you, but to escape discomfort. And every word she offers in that state moves you further away from the truth, not closer to it. This is why men who argue lose ground. Logic doesn't create attraction, it creates resistance. When you try to pin down consistency, you force her to choose between accountability and emotional comfort. And emotional comfort almost always wins, so she doesn't admit confusion. She doesn't say, "I don't know." She chooses a narrative that justifies her direction and allows her to feel at peace. And the more you push, the more firmly she commits to that version. Silence, on the other hand, does something entirely different. Silence removes pressure. Silence removes negotiation. Silence removes the need for justification. When you stop reacting, stop correcting, stop explaining, her emotional system has no external force to push against. And without resistance, something uncomfortable happens. She has to sit with her own inconsistency. That's when reflection begins. Not because you demanded it, but because you didn't interfere with it. Men misunderstand silence because they associate it with weakness or avoidance. In reality, silence is the strongest response to emotional instability. It signals self-sufficiency. It communicates that you don't need agreement to move forward. And that independence does something powerful. It removes your emotional availability as a stabilizer. She can no longer lean on your presence while sorting herself out. And that loss of access is what triggers awareness. This is where many women internally reassess, not out of guilt, but out of uncertainty. When you don't react the way she expects, the script breaks. She expected explanation, she expected emotion, she expected pursuit. When none of that arrives, the question forms quietly. Why didn't this affect him the way I thought it would? And that question lingers far longer than any argument ever could. But here's the part men must understand clearly. You don't stay silent to provoke regret. You stay silent because clarity doesn't require participation. You've already observed the shift. You've already noted the inconsistency. You don't need confirmation. Silence is not a tactic. It's alignment with reality, and women can sense the difference instantly. Fake silence feels performative. Real silence feels final. Once you stop engaging emotionally, the power dynamic flips, not because you gained control, but because you stopped giving it away. You're no longer asking to be understood. You're no longer trying to be chosen. You're simply moving in the direction of self-respect. And self-respect is magnetic in a way that validation seeking never is. This is also why men who keep explaining get stuck in loops. Every explanation invites reinterpretation. Every clarification opens a new angle. Every emotional display becomes something she can rationalize away. Silence closes loops. It ends dialogue without hostility. It leaves nothing to argue with, and what cannot be argued with must be felt. So if you've ever felt lied to, understand this. The lie wasn't always intentional, but the instability was real, and the moment you stop trying to correct the story and start observing the pattern, you step out of confusion permanently. You don't need truth delivered verbally anymore. You recognize it in behavior, timing, and consistency. And once you see that clearly, words lose their power to mislead you. When a man detaches calmly instead of emotionally, something fundamental shifts, not just in the dynamic, but in how he experiences his own life. He stops waking up with questions looping in his head. He stops checking signals, tone changes, response times. His attention returns inward. And that inward return is what most people mistake for coldness, when in reality, it's the restoration of self-direction. He's no longer orienting his nervous system around someone else's emotional weather. From the outside, this detachment is often misread. She may describe him as distant, different, or changed, but what she's actually sensing is the absence of emotional dependence. He's not withdrawn, he's unavailable for instability. He's no longer reacting in real time to her fluctuations, and that absence of reactivity removes the familiar rhythm she unconsciously relied on to feel grounded. This is where the reinterpretation begins. Not because he did anything dramatic, but because he didn't. No confrontation, no long explanation, no emotional plea, just a quiet shift in presence. And the human mind hates unexplained change, so it fills the gap with meaning. She may tell herself he moved on quickly, or that he never cared, or that he's become someone else entirely. These interpretations aren't about him, they're attempts to regain psychological equilibrium. What men don't realize is that emotional withdrawal without bitterness is one of the most destabilizing experiences for someone who operates primarily through feeling. There's nothing to push against, nothing to resist, nothing to blame, and when blame disappears, introspection becomes unavoidable. Not always immediately, but eventually, because unresolved emotional tension doesn't vanish, it relocates inward. This is why calm detachment often outlasts anger in its impact. Anger creates a villain, silence creates a mirror. When there's no emotional outburst to latch onto, the mind has to confront its own role in the outcome. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. It doesn't always lead to growth, but it always leads to awareness. Meanwhile, the man who detached isn't waiting for any of this. That's the crucial difference. His peace doesn't depend on her realization. He's not tracking her reactions. He's not monitoring outcomes. He's building a life that doesn't require emotional permission. And that independence changes how he moves in every area, not just relationships. This is where authority returns. Not authority over her, but authority over himself. He makes decisions without needing consensus. He chooses paths without requiring validation. And that internal authority is what many people respond to instinctively, not because it demands attention, but because it doesn't ask for it. At this stage, he also becomes immune to narrative shifts. If she reframes the past, it doesn't disturb him. If she minimizes what they had, it doesn't provoke defense. If she reaches out with curiosity or nostalgia, he doesn't rush to fill the space. He's no longer trying to protect a version of the story, because his sense of self isn't stored there anymore. This is the moment where most men realize the truth they were missing all along. Stability is more attractive than persuasion. Consistency is more powerful than explanation. And emotional restraint communicates strength far louder than emotional intensity ever could. The man who understands this stops performing and starts living. So when you detach calmly, you don't become invisible, you become undefined. And what cannot be defined cannot be controlled. You're no longer predictable, not because you're playing games, but because you're no longer operating from emotional obligation. And once a man reaches that point, confusion disappears, not because others change, but because he no longer needs them to. Once a man fully anchors himself in reality, instead of expectation, something irreversible happens. Betrayal loses its emotional grip. He no longer experiences shifts as personal attacks. He stops framing other people's decisions as reflections of his worth. What once felt like deception now registers as misalignment revealed. And that reframing is everything, because betrayal only wounds deeply when you believed consistency was guaranteed. This is where men finally understand that stability cannot be negotiated into existence. No amount of communication can force emotional alignment. No amount of patience can convert uncertainty into commitment. And once that truth lands, the impulse to chase clarity disappears. You don't ask questions whose answers won't change behavior. You observe, decide, and move. From this place, you stop entering relationships as an emotional investor looking for returns. You enter as a grounded participant who monitors conditions. If effort is mutual, you deepen. If effort fades, you step back, not dramatically, not resentfully, just accurately. This accuracy is what protects you, not walls, not bitterness, not detachment, masquerading as strength. Men who reach this stage are often described as different by those who knew them before, less reactive, less available, less eager to explain themselves. But what actually changed is internal alignment. They no longer outsource emotional regulation to someone else's consistency. Their nervous system isn't wired to someone else's moods anymore, and that autonomy creates calm that can't be shaken easily. This is also why these men rarely feel the need to warn others or preach lessons loudly. They don't need to convince anyone of truth. They live in it. They don't argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding. They don't stay in rooms where respect is conditional. They simply leave environments that don't match their internal standard. What's important here is that this clarity doesn't turn you cold. It turns you precise. You still feel attraction. You still feel interest. You still feel desire. But you no longer confuse intensity with depth. You let time reveal alignment instead of rushing to secure certainty. And because of that, you avoid the emotional whiplash that once drained you. At this point, you also stop fearing abandonment, not because you expect people to stay, but because you trust yourself to leave sooner next time. That trust removes anxiety at the root. You're no longer gripping tightly because you know you won't abandon yourself for connection, and that self-loyalty changes how you show up everywhere. If someone exits your life now, it registers as information, not injury. You adjust course instead of spiraling. You don't replay conversations searching for where you went wrong. You assess alignment, accept reality, and continue. This doesn't make you emotionally detached, it makes you emotionally efficient. This is how the cycle ends permanently. Not by finding someone better, not by proving anything, but by no longer building emotional meaning on unstable foundations. Once you stop mistaking words for truth and start treating patterns as reality, confusion disappears. And when confusion disappears, so does resentment. So the man who understands this doesn't walk around suspicious of others, he walks around anchored in himself. He doesn't accuse, he doesn't generalize, he simply moves with clarity, and clarity is the quiet end of suffering. Because nothing drains a man more than trying to make sense of behavior that was never meant to be consistent in the first place. Once this understanding locks in, future relationships stop feeling like emotional gambles. You're no longer hoping consistency will appear, you're verifying it over time. You don't assume honesty based on tone or intensity. You assume nothing until behavior repeats under pressure, and that patience changes everything, because patience isn't passivity, it's discernment, operating without anxiety. You also stop chasing emotional highs. You realize how deceptive intensity can be, how quickly passion can masquerade as alignment. The man you are now values calm attraction over explosive chemistry, because calm doesn't demand constant reassurance. Calm doesn't rewrite stories overnight. Calm stays recognizable even when circumstances shift. This is why your emotional energy becomes cleaner. You don't spend it decoding mixed signals or analyzing inconsistencies. You don't waste time asking, what did she mean by that? If meaning isn't clear through action, you don't invent it. You disengage from ambiguity without resentment, because ambiguity is no longer intriguing, it's inefficient. Men who reach this stage are rarely dramatic about boundaries. They don't announce them, they don't threaten departure. They simply stop showing up where alignment fades. And that quiet withdrawal often speaks louder than confrontation, because it's not fueled by emotion, it's fueled by certainty. This also changes how you respond to conflict. You don't rush to resolve discomfort at the cost of self-respect. You allow tension to exist long enough to see how the other person handles it. Do they take responsibility? Do they deflect? Do they rewrite? Their response tells you more than any apology ever could. You begin to notice that people either rise to this level of clarity or drift away, and you let them. You no longer chase alignment or try to educate others into consistency. You understand that maturity can't be taught through explanation. It's revealed through behavior. And you don't argue with what's revealed. This is where emotional independence becomes permanent. Not isolation, not avoidance. Independence. You enjoy connection without leaning on it. You value companionship without building identity around it. And because of that, you're no longer shaken by shifts that once felt catastrophic. Ironically, this is when healthier relationships begin to appear. Not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer available for instability. People who thrive on emotional chaos don't find traction with you anymore. They sense it immediately, and they move on without drama because there's nothing to hook into. You also stop narrating your experiences as betrayals. You see them as filters doing their job. Each inconsistency revealed something earlier than it might have otherwise. Each ending saved time you won't get back. And instead of carrying resentment, you carry discernment, which is far more useful. So the man who understands this doesn't fear being misled again. He knows confusion only exists when observation is ignored. He trusts patterns, he respects time, and he builds relationships the same way he builds anything meaningful. Slowly, deliberately, and without surrendering his sense of reality to someone else's emotions. At this stage, anger fades, not because you suppressed it, but because it no longer has a job. Anger exists to protect boundaries that were crossed. Once you learn to enforce boundaries early and quietly, anger becomes unnecessary. You don't need emotional spikes to defend yourself anymore. Your decisions do the protecting for you. You realize that most of your past frustration didn't come from women themselves. It came from expectation mismatch. You expected logical continuity. They operated on emotional continuity. Once you stop expecting one system to behave like the other, resentment dissolves. You're no longer offended by differences, you now understand. This is where peace replaces vigilance. You're no longer scanning for red flags obsessively. You don't interrogate behavior, you don't test loyalty, you let time and pressure reveal truth naturally. And because you're not emotionally invested too early, nothing revealed feels devastating, it just feels informative. You also stop needing closure conversations. Closure becomes internal. You don't need final explanations or confessions. You don't need admissions of guilt. You accept that people move according to their internal world, not your sense of fairness, and acceptance ends loops faster than confrontation ever could. This peace isn't passive, it's active alignment. You've aligned expectations with reality. You no longer build meaning on unstable ground. You don't interpret shifts as betrayals. You see them as indicators that alignment never existed in the first place. That reframing saves enormous emotional energy. Men who reach this point stop feeling like victims of circumstance. They recognize their agency, not in controlling others, but in choosing where to invest. That sense of agency is calming. You don't feel at the mercy of someone else's emotions, you feel responsible for your own positioning. This is also why you stop generalizing or demonizing. You don't need to label women as good or bad, honest or dishonest. Labels are shortcuts for people who haven't integrated the lesson yet. You simply assess behavior in context and act accordingly. No moral drama required. You begin to understand that emotional maturity isn't about demanding consistency, it's about responding correctly when consistency isn't present. Anyone can feel calm when things are stable. The real test is how you move when they're not, and now you move cleanly. From this place, relationships stop defining your self-worth. They become optional extensions of a stable life, not the foundation of it. You enjoy connection without needing it to validate you, and that independence is felt immediately by others, not as distance, but as solidity. So the final transformation isn't becoming colder or more detached, it's becoming unshakable. You no longer argue with emotional systems, you don't try to fix inconsistency, you observe, decide, and continue. And in doing so, you trade confusion for peace, something no argument, explanation, or emotional reaction could ever give you. At this level of understanding, love stops being a battlefield and starts becoming a choice. You no longer approach connection as something you must secure before it disappears. You don't cling to moments, you don't rush attachment, you allow interest to exist without immediately turning it into identity. And that alone separates you from most men, because most men confuse intensity with meaning and urgency with depth. You also realize that trust is not something you grant because someone sounds convincing. Trust becomes conditional on time, consistency, and behavior under discomfort. You don't punish people for being human, but you don't reward instability with access anymore. That distinction protects you from repeating the same emotional cycles under different names. This is where your perception of love matures. Love is no longer about being chosen. It's about mutual clarity, about two people moving in the same direction without coercion, fear, or constant reassurance. And if that clarity isn't present, you don't try to manufacture it. You step back and let reality speak for itself. You begin to notice how much of modern suffering comes from chasing emotional certainty in systems that are inherently fluid. Once you stop demanding permanence from feelings, disappointment loses its grip. You stop feeling shocked when emotions shift. You stop feeling entitled to consistency that was never promised through behavior. And that acceptance makes you resilient in a way that optimism never could. Men who reach this stage don't walk around guarded, they walk around awake. Awake to patterns, awake to timing, awake to their own emotional responses. They don't suppress desire, but they don't obey it blindly either. They let attraction exist without letting it overrule judgment. And judgment, when calm, is one of the most underrated strengths a man can develop. You also stop needing to convince anyone of your value. You no longer feel the urge to prove you are good, loyal, or sincere. Those things are internal standards now, not bargaining chips. If someone can't recognize them through your behavior, you don't argue, you disengage, because recognition can't be negotiated. It's either present or it isn't. This changes how you move through loss as well. Loss doesn't threaten your identity anymore. You don't ask, what did this say about me? You ask, what did this reveal? And revelation, even when uncomfortable, is useful. It sharpens future decisions instead of haunting past ones. At this point, even loneliness feels different. It's no longer desperation, it's space. space to refine standards, space to build a life that doesn't depend on emotional validation, space to become someone who chooses connection rather than needing it. And from that space, desperation has no leverage over you. You understand now why so many men stay angry. Anger keeps them tied to the story. It gives them something to hold on to. But once you let go of needing the story to make sense, anger dissolves. You don't need villains to feel justified. You don't need explanations to feel complete. You accept what is and move accordingly. So the final truth is this: you were never meant to win emotional arguments or decode shifting narratives. You were meant to build a life so grounded that emotional instability can't pull you off center. When you do that, confusion ends, not because people become consistent, but because you do. And consistency with yourself is the only kind that ever lasts. At some point you realize that the real shift didn't happen in how women behave, it happened in how you interpret reality. The same actions that once confused you now register as neutral data. The same emotional swings that once felt personal now feel predictable, and predictability removes fear. When fear disappears, attachment loosens naturally. You're no longer bracing for impact because you understand the terrain. This is why men who reach this level rarely talk about it loudly. There's nothing to prove, no lesson to force on others. They don't need to convince the world that they figured it out. Their calm speaks for itself, their pace slows, their reactions soften, and that softness isn't weakness. It's the absence of inner conflict. You also stop feeling the urge to expose anyone. You don't feel compelled to call out hypocrisy or inconsistency, not because you approve of it, but because exposure doesn't free you. Detachment does. You no longer need someone else to admit wrongdoing for you to move on cleanly. You don't wait for accountability to grant yourself peace. This is where emotional maturity becomes visible in your daily life. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you assume. You allow silence to do its work, and silence reveals more than confrontation ever could. It shows you who is comfortable without constant reassurance and who isn't. You also notice how rarely you feel the need to explain yourself now. Explanations used to be your way of seeking safety, of hoping clarity would bring closeness, but closeness built on explanation is fragile. Closeness built on shared direction doesn't require justification, and you've learned to tell the difference. At this point, attraction works differently. You're no longer drawn to intensity that burns hot and fast. You're drawn to steadiness, to emotional rhythm, to people whose behavior doesn't require translation. And because your nervous system is no longer addicted to emotional spikes, chaos stops feeling exciting. This is when you understand why so many men repeat the same story with different women. They never recalibrate their expectations. They change the face, but keep the framework. You change the framework, and once the framework changes, the outcome does too. Even if the world stays the same, you're no longer impressed by words that sound good in the moment. You're impressed by effort that survives discomfort, by presence that remains when novelty fades, by actions that don't need to be announced. And because your standards are internal now, you don't need to enforce them loudly. You simply stop investing when they aren't met. This is the quiet confidence most people can't name. Not arrogance, not indifference, just a man who knows he will be okay regardless of how someone else feels tomorrow. That knowledge removes desperation completely, and desperation is the one thing that distorts judgment more than anything else. So the final transformation isn't about distrusting women, or withdrawing from love, or building emotional walls. It's about trusting yourself enough to let reality unfold without interference, to stop forcing meaning where there is none, to stop anchoring identity to someone else's emotional state. And once you do that, life becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. And clarity is what keeps you grounded when everything else shifts. Eventually, you stop asking why things unfolded the way they did. Not because you found the perfect answer, but because you realized the question itself was keeping you stuck. Why keeps men trapped in the past, replaying moments that no longer exist? And the man you're becoming doesn't live backward. He lives forward, informed by experience, not imprisoned by it. This is where emotional clarity becomes instinctive. You no longer need to analyze every interaction or decode every tone shift. Your body tells you when something feels off, and you trust it. You don't override intuition with hope anymore. You don't silence discomfort just to maintain connection, and that trust in yourself becomes the quiet foundation beneath everything you do. You also stop trying to be understood by people who aren't capable of understanding you. Not everyone has the emotional depth, self-awareness, or accountability to meet you where you stand. And instead of resenting that, you accept it. Acceptance is not approval, It's simply the refusal to fight reality, and fighting reality was what exhausted you in the first place. This is when you realize how much emotional energy you used to waste trying to stabilize situations that were never meant to be stable. You tried to hold things together with effort, patience, and explanation. But real alignment doesn't require maintenance, it sustains itself naturally. And once you've experienced that difference, you never chase imbalance again. Your conversations become simpler now. You say less but mean more. You don't overshare to create closeness. You don't perform vulnerability to earn connection. You let trust build through time and consistency, not emotional confession. And because of that, the connections that do form feel lighter, safer, and far more real. You also stop romanticizing potential. Potential once felt intoxicating because it allowed you to imagine futures without requiring present alignment. Now you see potential for what it is, a possibility, not a promise. You no longer invest in what could be at the expense of what is, and that single shift saves you from years of unnecessary pain. This is when solitude stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like strength. You enjoy your own company without distraction. You don't rush to fill silence with noise or people. You use quiet to recalibrate, to reflect, to build. And from that place, you don't fear being alone, you fear being misaligned. When you look at relationships now, you don't ask, do they like me? You ask, do our values, effort, and direction match? That question changes everything. Because liking is fleeting, attraction fluctuates, but alignment either exists or it doesn't. And alignment is the only thing worth investing in long term. You understand now that feeling lied to was never about deception alone, it was about expectation. You expected permanence where there was emotional fluidity. You expected logic where there was intuition. Once you recalibrate those expectations, the sense of betrayal disappears, not because people become perfect, but because you stop misinterpreting what you're being shown. And this is where the journey truly settles. You don't emerge angry, you don't emerge closed off, you emerge steady, grounded, clear. A man who no longer argues with emotional reality, no longer chases certainty, no longer confuses words with truth. And from that place, you don't need to protect yourself aggressively because you finally know how to move correctly.